system of fiat money became the global norm, the supply of money has grown exponentially. In fact, we've seen the greatest growth in the supply of money in history. But who benefits? Of course, those that have the power to issue money, governments and banks. Then, those companies and individuals that get this money early. They can spend it before the prices of the things they want to buy have risen to reflect the new money in circulation. In other words, they get services, products or assets cheap. But prices soon rise, so holders of assets such as houses or shares will then see gains without there necessarily being any improvements to the company or house in question. Often this can lead to speculative bubbles. But what about those at the bottom of the pyramid? Those on fixed wages or incomes, those who live in remote areas, or those with savings? By the time this newly created money and bigger.
Well, when you get off the gold standard and you go into a fiat money currency, combined with a fractional reserve banking system, you end up compounding debt faster than you can ever possibly produce to support that debt. So eventually you're going to find yourself back into debt slavery. And that's what's happened in the U.S. For every dollar of GDP, for example, in the U.S., it also creates something like $5.50 worth of debt. Because this is what happens when our economy flips over and basically capsizes. And of course, the government solution now to address all the problems is basically to create more debt.
You can never get enough of a currency that doesn't work. You can print it till kingdom comes, but you can't print wealth, and you can't get yourself out of debt by making more debt. If you could print wealth, Zimbabwe would be the largest, most prosperous country on the planet. We all know it doesn't work.
Of the money in the world today, 97% of it is debt. The French philosopher Voltaire once said, "All paper money eventually returns to its intrinsic value, zero." For 3 generations, the world watched the fight between capitalism and communism. But in the 1980s, the Russian economy started to collapse. The Soviet Union capitulated, and so-called capitalism reigned supreme.
Before 1989, we had a battle between communism and the market. And in that battle, there was a sense of, let's not expose the flaws in the market economy. This is too important of a battle that you don't criticize our team while we're fighting their team. And their team, associated with authoritarianism, with a failure to deliver well-being to their society, it was very clear that if you had to choose between these two, which was better?
Communism failed first for various reasons. I think it was inefficient, human rights, lack of respect, so forth. So capitalist West has been continuing in a triumphalist mode, thinking, our adversary has failed, that means we're doing everything right. Both systems are trying to do something which is fundamentally impossible, grow forever. And they're both going to fail. One failed first. Capitalism's going to fail later, or it's failing now.
America right now is in a very interesting position because in the past 200-300 years of its history, it's a culture and country which has almost always existed on the assumption that resources could be expanded. If there was a problem, you always try to deal with it by expanding the pie. Go west, young man. Make the pie bigger so that everyone's got a bigger piece. Now it's facing a world where possibly resources are beginning to be more constrained and where it's going to have to divide up that pie and inflict pain on people. And that's something which it is not well prepared for.
How has the country moved so far from the intentions of its founding fathers? How has the American dream become so distorted?
Over the last 30 or 40 years, capitalism has taken this extreme form. And a lot of it goes back to the economist Milton Friedman from the Chicago School and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and others buying into these policies that really encourage people to take on huge amounts of debt, encourage privatization, smaller government supposedly, although bigger military, so actually the government spending goes up. Deregulation, getting rid of rules that govern the people who run our institutions, especially our corporations. It's as though we suddenly are supposed to believe that the human beings who sit at the top of corporations don't need to be regulated. They're some sort of gods.
Milton Friedman, his protégés the Chicago Boys, and the neoclassical ideology beat the classical approach to economics and became the framework for what we today call capitalism. There are two main competing economic approaches which determine how we humans manage the world and distribute wealth. These are the classical and neoclassical schools. The classical school favours less government interference, more personal autonomy, and recognises that humans cannot function without natural resources. The neoclassical school, which has a more dismissive view of natural resources, thinks government should rule the economy, solve social problems, and leave the free market to look after the distribution of wealth. The neoclassical school emerged around 100 years ago due to vested interests' desire to protect their assets. This meant that neoclassical mathematical models and assumptions were divorced from reality. They're based on what ought to be, instead of the classical models which are based on what actually is. It's these neoclassical models, which favour large corporations, that have been used to legitimize the financialization of the global economy. Championed by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, neoclassical economics still dominates policy-making today.
The Reagan Revolution, as we call it in the United States, obviously the Reagan-Thatcher Revolution, if you think about it more globally, was a big change in power structure and a big transfer of opportunity and wealth. Now, it's not that the poor gave it to the rich. It was a transfer within the well-to-do, so that the financial sector, in particular, in the United States, for example, but also in the UK and some other places, became vastly more profitable, and wages in that sector went up a lot. I mean, we focus on bonuses, but it's also base salaries went up a lot, overall compensation. So there's a transfer from the non-financial part of the economy to the financial part of the economy that actually is unprecedented as far as we can see in any of the available data to us. And I'm talking about all of recorded human history.
In 1932, in the aftermath of America's great stock market crash, a piece of legislation was passed to protect society. The Glass-Steagall Act was introduced to separate ordinary high street banking from investment banking. 67 years later, in 1999, under the influence of Treasury Secretary Larry Summers and his predecessor Robert Rubin, President Bill Clinton repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. Once again, banks could take ordinary depositors' money and speculate with it on virtually anything they liked.
Wall Street has become a very particular type of casino. And it's unfortunately not the kind of casino they have in Las Vegas, which is, perfectly legitimate form of entertainment. It is a casino that has massive negative repercussions on the rest of society. So it's not just losing your money on a few wild nights. It's about the way in which those organizations lose their money, impacting the whole of society, leading to a massive loss of jobs.
This unfettered gambling pushed the entire global financial system to near collapse. With balances and debt obligations larger than the GDP of entire countries, the banks had become too big to fail. The West was unprepared, and bankers met their reeling and disorientated governments.
You have to bail us out. We need money. If you don't give us the money, the whole thing goes down. And what are you going to do with millions and tens of millions of people who have lost everything in their bank account? You will have a revolution on your hands. So fork over the money. borrow the money, create it out of nothing, and give it to us, and so that we can face our problems and not go under, or otherwise. And this is what Mr. Hank Paulson did in the U.S. Congress. He went there one day and he told them, well, look, we need $700 billion, and we need it now, or else.
Is this system we call capitalism really capitalism? In a capitalist system, government is supposed to be small, but today the state is more bloated and invasive than it's ever been. Individuals and companies are supposed to operate in a free market. Good enterprise is rewarded with profit, and flawed enterprise with failure. But during the 2008 banking crisis, the people saw the Western economic system divided in a way they were told could never happen.
Socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor. And in America, for example, the banks that got in trouble got bailed out by the government. That's socialism. And people are arguing against socialism in America, and yet this is probably the most socialist country in the world right now.
We have a system which isn't even a proper capitalist system. Rich people make mistakes that they don't get punished. Poor people make mistakes that they get punished. Yeah? Or even worse, that they don't make any mistake and they are forced to pay for the mistakes of the rich.
When the taxpayer is footing the bill for the misplaced speculation of bankers, then suddenly, instead of the economy serving the human being is now in perpetual service to amoral financial organizations. It was the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, Alan Greenspan, who after 9/11 slashed interest rates to encourage lending. Bankers needed new participants to keep cash flowing into a system that had become a global pyramid scheme. All this newly created money entered the housing market and created unprecedented inflation, house prices rose and rose. New mothers were forced back into the workplace to service huge home loans, and the Anglo-American dream became all about land speculation.
The housing market in the West